Well, kia ora everyone, I might kick into it. Thanks Zeb for having me, and Jeff and Rachel, Afforestation, for having us here. Yeah, feeling really blessed to be here with you all. Have had some amazing, really robust conversations just last night and this morning. So yeah, really enjoying being here with you all. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name's Finn Ross. I'm a PhD candidate researching seaweed as a natural climate solution out of the Blue Carbon Lab in Melbourne at Deakin University. I'm also chair of a new group called Future Farmers NZ, and working on a startup in carbon trading called Carbon Z. And lucky enough, while I'm working on these ventures, to be based on my family farm, Lake Hawea while I'm in New Zealand. On Lake Hawea, we're the first carbon zero certified farm in Australasia. While we're pretty new to the sector, we're trying to learn as much as we can and really trying to embrace and lead in this sort of new future of agriculture in New Zealand, and working with a bunch of agri-tech startups, trying to just do a heap of learning on the farm, a bunch of trial and error, and embracing a bunch of new practices, and are fully in on the regen journey down there as well, and generating a premium based off our own brand we've created for the property called Carbon Clear. One of the companies we're working with on the farm is these guys, Sheep Inc. They're a UK-based sweater company with a QR code, so you can, if you buy the sweater and you're in the world, you can track it back to our farm. So yeah, that's been one of the connections we've been able to make on the farm through branding our product and selling it to the world. But yeah, here to talk to you about three things today. Firstly, Future Farmers NZ, what we're up to there. Secondly, He Waka Eke Noa, because I think as a sector, it's potentially the most important policy for the agricultural sector in the next decade that's going to be decided this year, and I think it's super important we all become really literate on what's happening with He Waka Eke Noa and emissions pricing in New Zealand. And then thirdly, seaweed and some of the opportunities for seaweed in the agricultural sector. But a little bit of background on how I got here. As a kid, I was my dream was always to be in the bush. I read Barry Grump's Bush, and I wanted to be a possum trapper or a deer stalker. That was who I am, and that's where my heart is in the bush and in Fiordland. And if I wasn't here, that's where I'd be. I'd be trapping possums with my dog in Fiordland. That's what I would love to be doing. But out of school, had the opportunity to study in the States at UC Davis, and I took a climate change class, and I'd already, I guess, had a bit of a sense through my parents' interest in being in the bush, tramping with my mum or spearfishing with my dad, had this sort of interest in what's happening in our environment, but was never, I guess, fully aware, and then was thrown into this massive industrial agricultural system. So UC Davis, where I was, is essentially the Lincoln of the States, massive agricultural university, and was exposed to this huge system that was really destroying the planet. And went to this climate change lecture and really had this aha moment where I was like, oh my God, how isn't everyone walking around every day just screaming about this? And I cried after this first lecture, because I was like, just hit me, wow, this is everything. The climate crisis is everything. What the hell am I going to do? And then throughout the 4 years of my undergrad, went on this process learning about everything that's going wrong on the planet. And I guess with that came a lot of climate anxiety, and then I was sort of pulled to action and decided how can I pull my resources, how can I contribute and give back to the planet, and ultimately I found that through my research, through my PhD. So that's a little bit of background around how I've got into these ventures, and I guess saw that the world is really dying at our feet, and how can I contribute to the healing of our planet. So firstly, Future Farmers NZ, I guess, was coming newly to the agricultural sector with my family, moving onto the farm Lake Hawea 4 years ago. Was having conversation with Zeb and like-minded people, I guess, of a similar vintage to us, young people super passionate about farming in New Zealand, but who have also realised that we've got a lot of things wrong in the sector. New Zealand's got the highest proportion of threatened species in the world, something we should collectively be deeply ashamed of. We've got exorbitant emissions coming from our country. We've freshwater crisis, amongst the highest rates of deforestation per capita in the world. we've got a huge amount to work on as a sector. You know, the mental health incidents, we've got, you know, suicide rates are noticeably higher in the sector than elsewhere. Strong wool, the commodity we, you know, to some extent built our nation on, we now, you know, largely burn or bury underwater at shearing time, which I think are a lot of key signs, regardless of financial performance or ecological performance. Some of those are key signs that we've got it wrong as a sector, and there's really radical change needed. So that was some of the ideas that brought this Future Farmers group together. And what we're doing, there's around 15 or so of us, I guess, all involved in different points in the agricultural sector. So there's people like me who are doing a bunch of different projects. There's a couple of on-the-ground farmers, some people involved in the research, academic side, and also people involved in some of the industry groups as well. We're super diverse from across the country and in our professions, our early career professions, and also really diverse politically, so with members from all 4 major parties in New Zealand. And we've come together over the last year to write a big manifesto on what we think, what the vision, our vision is for the future of farming in New Zealand. And with that vision, we're just sort of describing in 2050 what we want to see the agricultural landscape look like in New Zealand, and then the associated policy actions that are going to come with that. And we're hoping to release that manifesto in just over a month's time to the public, and then get to work on some of the policy points that we as a group have agreed on. And I guess the premise of the group is, if this sort of really young, diverse group of people can come together and agree on some of these policy points, well, then hey, you know, why should the rest of New Zealand not also agree on a lot of these points? And so that's how we pivoted to He Waka Eke Noa, and that's how I started my learning journey there. We realised as a group, Future Farmers NZ, hey, this He Waka Eke Noa thing is going to be huge for the sector, and it's something we should, you know, do a lot of learning on and have a stance on. So for those of you who don't know what's happening with He Waka Eke Noa, I'll give a super quick 2-minute overview. A bunch of industry groups got together and said, hey, the government has said by law now that agricultural emissions are going to be priced within the next 5 years. And at the moment, how it's set up by law is that agriculture will go into the emissions trading scheme and will be priced that way. The industry group got together and said, hey, we don't think that's a good option. Pretty much, I think unanimously now in New Zealand, we think that's not a good option for agriculture to go into the ETS for a lot of reasons. Industry group got together and said, hey, we're going to provide some alternatives. So they've gone through a big consultation process, which is just about to finish. And they've given 2 options to New Zealand to price agricultural emissions, which are 50% of our country's total emissions. And the 2 options are a farm levy approach, where every farmer in New Zealand by 2025 will have to do some sort of reporting on their emissions budget. And if their farm's carbon positive, sequestering more than they're emitting, they'll be able to receive a bit of income for that. And if their farm's the opposite, carbon negative, they'll have to pay a levy for that. And that'll be reported all at the farm level. And to give a bit of a sense of scale for this, where it's all designed to see a 10% in methane emission reduction by 2030, sorry. Which is at current prices $1.3 billion worth of carbon credits on the New Zealand emissions, the New Zealand carbon market, the emissions trading scheme. And the cost of implementing the farm levy approach is a little over $600 million. So on carbon projects, there's a ratio that's often used to see how efficient carbon projects are, is the ratio at which money is spent on administration versus the return from carbon credits. So the ratio for the farm levy approach is $1 we're spending on administration for a $1.80 return in carbon credits. And typically for carbon projects, you want that ratio to be about 1 to 9. So you're only spending 10% of the financial resources are administration, and you're getting 90% is from the carbon credits. So on the surface, the farm levy approach, which is largely now most of the industry groups are supporting in New Zealand, and has a lot of strengths, is extremely inefficient in terms of emissions reduction as a comparison to spending. So there's a huge amount of bureaucracy being spent on this, and this is what we realise as Future Farmers, is that New Zealand's about to go down this path. It seems like generally the tide is swinging to this farm levy approach. But generally, why are we doing this? It's for climate change, because we want climate action, but it seems like this is really inefficient spending of resources. How can we do it more efficiently? The second option is this producer levy, where it's looking about $100 million spending over 5 years to get that same that same reduction of 13 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, whereby farmers don't have to pay, but it's a levy at the producer levy. So if you're a dairy farmer, Fonterra will just you'll get a slightly lower price because Fonterra will be paying this emissions levy. So future farmers have come up with this concept where we've sort of combined what we think's the best of both. We're trying to put it in the hands of farmers as much as we can by giving them access to voluntary markets. So there's an increasing amount happening in that space, which I'm involved with, so farmers can get reward for voluntary credits from regenerating native bush on their properties. And then the other big one that's about to come will be methane abatement credits. So farmers can go to voluntary credit markets in the future to get credits for the methane that they've reduced as a result of a management change on farm. So yeah, super keen to get into a discussion on that if you've got any questions on He Waka Eke Noa. And then thirdly, seaweed. So I guess it's a bit of a vogue term at the moment. A lot of people interested in seaweed. And broadly with seaweed as a natural climate solution, there's 4 ways we can use it, and I'll get to the opportunities specifically in the agricultural sector. Firstly, there's seaweed farming. So seaweed farming is huge in Southeast Asia. A lot of seaweed as it grows, incredibly quick growth, great source of biomass. We can get almost double the production per hectare from seaweed as we can get from anything on land. So whether it's sorghum, pine, hemp, you can double the yield per hectare with seaweed with no fertilizer or water input. So phenomenally efficient resource. One of the species we've got in Littleton, giant kelp, it's the fastest growing species of anything on the planet, up to 0.5 metre a day growth rates, which is just absolutely phenomenal. So it's a really underutilised resource that I think a lot of the world outside Southeast Asia is now waking up to, including us here in New Zealand. So that's one way we can use seaweed as a natural climate solution, is just this incidental shedding of carbon as seaweed grows on seaweed farms. Secondly, it's restoring wild seaweed forests. So in Tasmania, 95% of the kelp forests have been lost, so it's the equivalent of the Australian bushfires underwater. Massive scale loss of these kelp systems, which is pretty horrific. So restoring those potentially we'll get a bit of a carbon benefit from that, although neither of those two are proven. We're still working on the research for that. Thirdly is this concept called ocean afforestation, by introducing seaweed out into the open ocean and sending it down to the deep sea, specifically as a carbon sink. And then fourthly are opportunities for emission abatement in agriculture and other industry sectors. And I'll talk to a couple of the potential applications in the agricultural industry. So there's agri-sector now who have got a drench. There's fertilizer products. There's stock feed as well in seaweed applications. Generally now, there's so many different products. Almost anything you can think of now, there's someone working on a seaweed version of that, be it fabrics, biofuels, bioplastics, pharmaceuticals, food, and then the agricultural applications with stock feed and fertilizer, which are both super promising. But potentially the most exciting one that I'm really excited about in the future of the New Zealand agricultural landscape is this methane-reducing seaweed called Asparagopsis. And a few of you might have heard of it, but essentially how it works is this red seaweed that grows in Stewart Island and Tasmania. It's called Asparagopsis, and the idea is that if you feed that to your livestock, your cattle, that you'll cut their methane emissions by over 90%. So some studies have indicated that with a 0.5% daily supplement of the seaweed, so 0.5% of the stock's daily intake has got to come from the seaweed, you'll be getting upwards of a 90% reduction in methane emissions, which is potentially a massive change in the New Zealand agricultural landscape for reducing emissions. And there's a lot of other methane reducers that we're looking at in New Zealand, be it these bolus slow-release methane reducers or chemical methane reducers, methane vaccines, etc. But this seaweed has potential to cut methane emissions by the most, which in a country with exorbitantly high methane emissions is something that we should seriously be looking at. And just quickly looping back to that He Waka Eke Noa, a point that I made about sort of a large amount of spending. If the government's prepared to spend $500 million on emissions reduction in the agricultural sector via emissions pricing, from a utilitarian perspective, we could be much better spending that entire pool on methane reducing seaweed in New Zealand. Not suggesting that we should do that, but it's definitely brings into perspective how big this opportunity is for New Zealand. So how it works is obviously it's seen as a potential cost to farmers. Hey, we've got to feed this out. How do we get it to our stock every day? Which is the big criticism. It's designed for a feedlot system because they've got to be somewhere where they can eat these pellets every day. And there's a lot being worked on now on how we can get it out in more pastoral systems. So like on in the farm, our high country system we're looking at ways of getting it out to the stock in the back blocks and in the tussock, potentially via salt licks or troughs, or mixing it into our winter feed solutions like that. And the other really compelling thing that comes to this Asparagopsis seaweed is it's got a compound in it called a bromoform, which is the compound that inhibits Methanogenesis, which is the process by which methane is created in the gut of a ruminant. And generally, Methanogenesis by those bacteria in the gut of a ruminant is a wasted resource. So that food that the cattle was going to use is actually now being converted by these bacteria into methane. So it's wasted food. So in some of these trials that have happened now with this red seaweed Asparagopsis, there's also been increased growth rates of up to 10% in some cattle trials, which is super compelling for farmers. So it might be a solution on its own for increasing yields on farm, regardless of the methane reducing component. So that's a couple of the things happening in the seaweed space. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys. I've actually got a country calendar shooting on the family farm this weekend, so I've got a boost after this. But I thought I'd leave I've got 10 minutes just for some questions and a quick discussion with you guys, if that works.
Can I just ask about the health of the animal? Like, if they're producing excess methane, is there a reason? Like, is it because of the high sugar feeds or whatever that they're eating? And if they're having the seaweed, how does that affect the animal's health if it's reducing the methane? Like, have they done studies like that as well?
Short answer, not to my knowledge, but I think there's two separate bits of research. One is that generally the gut health of ruminants on a more diverse diet versus what we've got largely across New Zealand at the moment, which I think is potentially what you're referring to, which is quite compelling. That hey, maybe on a more regenerative diet, that stock are lower emitters in themselves without even the seaweed additive, which to my understanding the research hasn't quite been done on that, but intuitively it's something a lot of people are looking at for sure.
What is a seaweed farm? Or what does the system look like? Like, is it all wild, or are people specifically farming seaweed, and then like how does that work with consents and like what sort of the industry look like?
In New Zealand, it doesn't look like anything. We don't have any seaweed farms yet. There's a lot of people who are super interested in it and trying to get the consenting process through, but New Zealand's got some really significant roadblocks around that consenting process, which does mean we haven't got seaweed farms established. But it's a super simple infrastructure, really. All you need is a rope to grow seaweed on, rope and a couple of floats hanging at a couple of meters below the surface. And that's what most of the seaweed infrastructure around the world is in Southeast Asia, just super simple seaweed farms with a couple of Coke bottles and a bit of rope, and then a rock as the anchor. So it's pretty simple infrastructure in shallow areas. Yeah.
Christine Jones, she talks about methanotrophes in the soil and them actually becoming, in a well-functioning biological soil, a sink for methane. Have you delved into that?
Yeah, not really, to be honest. So that's soil microbes that are reacting with methane to break it down quicker into carbon and yeah, right. And the suggestion there is that hey, in a really healthy soil environment, we've got a lot more of the microbes. Yeah.
And what we're doing is, as farmers, we're suppressing basically nature's sink for the idea that there's no waste in nature. But yeah, I mean that's something because I was very I was like, oh, how as a dairy farmer we've got so much methane. And she said that, and there were some studies that she referred to that were it was pretty like it seemed like it wasn't a problem, but I just wondered if there's you're obviously in that space, if people are looking into that, being like, is this more of a problem than, do we think it's a bigger problem than it really is? Are we, like you talked about before, are we solving the solutions already with regen farming?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and without knowing a lot about the topic, I'd say, there's obviously methane emissions that come out either end of the cow, but there's also significant methane emissions that come from degradation of manure on pastures. So possibly the soil microbes are inhibiting that a lot, but the methane emissions that are coming out either end, there's pretty quick diffusion of that methane, and there's probably only some of it is being locked away in the soil. Yeah.
A thing I'd love to see looked at a bit more is comparing methane emissions from horned and unhorned cows, because when you look at, if you remove the horns of a cow, and like the horn I had here last night, if I had it I'd show you, you see that the sinuses and the cow's head go right out into the horn, and it's very vasculated in that area. And I remember a friend once saying who had just a small number of sort of pet cows, she said if they're chewing their cud, their horns are quite hot, but when they're just out grazing or some other time, if you touch the horns, they're quite cool. So like when they're chewing the cud and when the air's coming up, are they sending that up into these sinuses and actually resorbing that methane? Because it just seems such an inefficiency of nature to be putting methane, this high energy substance, out into the air. Why
I
can't
think
we
it's
do
more of
it?
a symptom of
Is it
broken
because
system.
we have dehorned the cows and they can't complete that digestive process of methane and actually absorb a lot more of the methane?
Yeah, no, it's not something I'm across, but yes, it sounds, yeah.
To research, if they know how to research what's coming out of these animals, just test it on some horned animals.
There's unhorned, yeah, sure.
One of the problems with the research is that they do research in a very isolated, they put it in a box and you can't have methanogenesis bacteria sitting inside the box because it's not part of the big system. Yeah. So the same would apply to testing, how does it work with cow with horns if they're not on the soil?
Who's going to finance that?
Yeah, that's the trouble. It's obviously a multi-million-dollar question, and no one will do the research.
No. Carbon sequestration through the liquid carbon pathway in your soil as shouldn't be for farmers. How is that not able to be used as a credit?
It's a good question. One I've had a lot lately, actually, particularly in He Waka Eke Noa. There's a lot of farmers who, in that consultation process, really want soil carbon credits. And the answer is yes, we should get soil carbon credits for me anyway at some stage, but there's no global standardized methodology yet for measuring soil carbon. And the difficulty is it's because monitoring's quite expensive for the return you can get. Just within one paddock, you can get a completely different soil carbon readings within the paddock. So it's super easy to standardize a forest. You can look at an aerial photograph and say, hey, this is how much is happening. But soil carbon, you've actually got to take a bunch of physical measurements across the property. And if you can imagine how much variation you can have within soil carbon within one paddock, just across a farm or within a catchment area. So I think the issue has been standardising that where they can actually assign a value that's somehow reasonable. But the answer possibly, there's a new company called Carbon Central, and they've got this thing called eddy covariance, which is a sensor that measures transpiration and a bunch of gas flux in an area, and you can sort of put in a satellite map and say, and it just measures the straight carbon flux off that area, and that would be a way to more efficiently measure soil carbon. Yeah.
What's your PhD topic?
Seaweed as a natural climate solution.
Just wanted to go back to type back to you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Is there anything that indicates what the difference is with the ocean when you go seaweed farming? Does it have an effect on the ocean?
We had a conversation about this last night, and I think we've got an opportunity with aquaculture to do everything we've done with agriculture again, but from start. And the question I often has is, I'm sort of encouraging a lot of people to get into the aquaculture space, but are we just about to make the same mistakes in the ocean? Which is something I guess I'm quite concerned about. But largely the research out of Southeast Asia from these massive scale seaweed farms, a lot of them are big monocultures, has actually been positive for communities, and dare I say it, has had positive environmental outcomes. Lowering acidification is a big one that seaweed can help with, lowering eutrophication. Or, New Zealand's got massively eutrophied, eutrophication in our coastlines now from all our rivers dumping sediment and extra nutrients. Seaweed can suck a lot of that in and also provide habitat for fisheries. So largely the environmental outcomes are going to be positive from seaweed farming.
Are you aware of any research being done in freshwater species that can do similar things to seaweed? Or? There's
a lot happening in freshwater for microalgae. Super high protein, super efficient, and particularly for biofuel, I think there's some quite exciting research happening from converting microalgae to biofuel, which is obviously a big emission abatement opportunity if we can, have a fuel source that's carbon zero. Yeah.
Hey, thanks. Very impressed with your work, and also I came in a bit late, unfortunately, but hearing about what Future Farmers is doing, it's really exciting. Just on the methane and the work you're doing around seaweed, how much, using seaweed in the diet can reduce methane. Is there anything else it can do? Because obviously we want to be able to be, hitting as many sort of positive impacts at the same time. So you reduce methane, what else is it doing in terms of reducing the environmental impact of dairying?
Yeah, good question. The research is it's still super new. So the only stuff that's been peer reviewed is that it reduces methane and it increases growth rates. So yeah, I probably can't speak to the further environmental outcomes of it. But I guess generally farmers like us, embracing it as a part of it, new system, I think is really exciting. Yeah.
Is there anywhere people can just follow what you're up to?
Yeah, cool. Instagram, I'm an Instagrammer. Eco-interpreter is me, so that's where you can check it out. Yeah. Cool.
Well, that was pretty awesome.
Thanks for the opportunity, Zeb. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.